Motivation is the set of forces that causes people to engage in one behavior rather than some alternative behavior. Managers strive to motivate people in the organization to perform at high levels. This means getting them to work hard, come to work regularly, and to make positive contributions to the organization's mission. But job performance depends on ability and environment as well as motivation. The relationship can be stated as follows: P equals M times A times E, where P equals performance, M equals motivation, A equals ability, and E equals the environment. To reach high levels of job performance, an employee must want to do the job well, motivation, be able to do the job effectively, ability, and have the materials, resources, equipment, and information required to do the job, the environment. A deficiency in any one of these areas hurts performance. A manager should thus strive to ensure that all three components are met. In most settings, motivation is the most difficult of the factors to manage. If an employee lacks the ability to perform, he or she can be sent to training programs to learn new job skills. If the person cannot learn those skills, she or he can be transferred to a simpler job and replaced with a more skilled worker. If an employee lacks materials, resources, equipment, or information, the manager can take steps to provide those resources. But if motivation is deficient, the manager faces a more complex situation of determining what will motivate the employee to work harder. Of course, it's also important to understand what motivates us personally. A need is something an individual requires or wants. This figure shows the basic motivational framework we use to organize our discussion. Motivated behavior usually begins when a person has one or more important needs. Although a need that is already satisfied may also motivate behavior, for example, the need to maintain a standard of living when one is already achieved, unmet needs usually result in more intense feelings and behavioral changes. Motivation begins with a need deficiency. One of the first writers to address work motivation over a century ago was Frederick Taylor. Taylor developed a method for structuring jobs that he called scientific management. Scientific management is an approach to motivation that assumes employees are motivated by money. As one basic premise of this approach, Taylor assumed that employees are economically motivated and work to earn as much money as possible. Hence, he advocated incentive pay systems. He believed that managers knew more about the jobs being performed than did workers, and he assumed that economic gain was the primary thing that motivated everyone. Other assumptions of the traditional approach were that work is inherently unpleasant for most people, and that the money they earn is more important to employees than the nature of the job they're performing. Hence, people could be expected to perform any kind of job if they were paid enough. Although the role of money as a motivating factor cannot be dismissed, proponents of the traditional approach took too narrow of a view of the role of monetary compensation and also failed to consider other motivational factors. The human relations approach supplanted scientific management in the 1930s. The human relations approach assumed that employees want to feel useful and important, that employees have strong social needs, and that these needs are more important than money in motivating employees. Advocates for the human relations approach advised managers to make workers feel important and allow them a modicum of self-direction and self-control in carrying out routine activities. The feelings of involvement and importance were expected to satisfy workers' basic social needs and result in higher motivation to perform. The human resource approach to motivation carries the concepts of needs and motivation one step further. The human resource view, which began to emerge in the 1950s, assumes that contributions themselves are valuable to both individuals and organizations. It assumes that people want to contribute and are able to make genuine contributions. Management's task, then, is to encourage participation and create a work environment that makes full use of the human resources available. The basic premise of need-based theories and models is that humans are motivated primarily by deficiencies in one or more important needs or need categories. Need theorists have attempted to identify and categorize the needs that are most important to people. Some observers call these content theories because they deal with the content or substance of what motivates behavior. The best known need theories are the hierarchy of needs and the ERG theory. The hierarchy of needs, developed by psychologist Abraham Maslow in the 1940s, is the best-known needs theory. Influenced by the human relations school, Maslow argued that human beings are wanting animals. They have innate desires to satisfy a set of given needs. Furthermore, Maslow believed that these needs are arranged in a hierarchy of importance, with the most basic needs at the foundation of the hierarchy. Here's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The three sets of needs at the bottom of the hierarchy, physiological, security, and belongingness, are called deficiency needs because they must be satisfied for the individual to be fundamentally comfortable. The top two sets of needs, esteem and self-actualization, are termed growth needs because they focus on personal growth and development. The most basic needs in the hierarchy are physiological needs. These include the needs for food, sex, and air. Next in the hierarchy are security needs, things that offer safety and security, such as adequate housing and clothing and freedom from worry and anxiety. Belongingness needs, the third level of the hierarchy, are primarily social. Examples include the need for love and affection and the need to be accepted by peers. The fourth level, esteem needs, actually encompass two slightly different kinds of needs: the need for positive self-image and self-respect, and the need to be respected by others. At the top of the hierarchy are self-actualization needs. These involve a person's realizing his or her full potential and becoming all that he or she can be. Maslow believed that each need level must be satisfied before the level above it can become important. Thus, once physiological needs have been satisfied, their importance diminishes and security needs emerge as the primary sources of motivation. The escalation up the hierarchy continues until self-actualization needs become the primary motivators. Maslow's needs hierarchy makes a certain amount of intuitive sense, and because it was the first motivation theory to become popular, it's also one of the best known among practicing managers. However, research has revealed a number of deficiencies in the theory. The ERG theory describes existence, readiness, and growth needs. In many aspects, ERG theory extends and refines Maslow's needs theory concept, although there are several important differences between the two. The ERG stand for the three basic categories: existence, readiness, and growth needs. Let's take a look. Existence needs are those necessary for basic human survival. They roughly correspond to the physiological and security needs of Maslow's hierarchy. Readiness needs, those involving the need to relate to others, are similar to Maslow's belongingness and esteem needs. Finally, growth needs are analogous to Maslow's needs for self-esteem and self-actualization. In contrast to Maslow's approach, however, ERG theory suggests that more than one kind of need, for example, both readiness and growth needs, may motivate a person at the same time. A more important difference from Maslow's hierarchy is that the ERG theory introduced a satisfaction progression component and a frustration regression component. The satisfaction progression component suggests that after satisfying one category of needs, a person progresses to the next level. The satisfaction progression concept suggests that after satisfying one category of needs, a person progresses to the next level. Two-factor theory, the dual structure theory, identifies motivation factors which affect satisfaction and hygiene factors which determine dissatisfaction. The two-factor theory once played a major role in managerial thinking about motivation, and though few researchers today accept the theory, it is nevertheless still widely known and accepted among practicing managers. Frederick Herzberg and his associates developed the two-factor theory in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Herzberg began by interviewing approximately 200 accountants and engineers in Pittsburgh. He asked them to recall times that they felt especially satisfied and motivated by their jobs, and times that they felt particularly dissatisfied and unmotivated. To his surprise, Herzberg found that entirely different sets of factors were associated with the two kinds of feelings about work. People associated entirely different causes, such as recognition or achievement, with satisfaction and motivation. The findings led Herzberg to conclude that the prevailing thinking about satisfaction and motivation was incorrect. Herzberg research identified different influences from two different sets of factors. He argued that two different dimensions must be included. Thus, he saw motivation as a two-factor phenomenon, with motivation factors and hygiene factors serving different purposes. This figure illustrates the two-factor concept that there's one dimension ranging from satisfaction to no satisfaction, and another ranging from dissatisfaction to no dissatisfaction. The two dimensions must presumably be associated with the two sets of factors identified in the initial interviews. In addition, the figure lists the primary factors identified in Herzberg interviews. Motivation factors such as achievement, recognition, and the opportunity to plan and control their own work were often cited by people as primary causes of satisfaction and motivation. When present in a job, these factors apparently could cause satisfaction and motivation. When they're absent, they would result in feelings of no satisfaction rather than dissatisfaction. The other set of factors, hygiene factors, came out in response to the questions about dissatisfaction and lack of motivation. The respondents suggested that pay, job security, supervisors, and working conditions, if seen as inadequate, could lead to feelings of dissatisfaction. When these factors were considered acceptable, however, the person still was not necessarily satisfied. Rather, he or she was simply not dissatisfied. Unlike many other theorists, Herzberg described explicitly how managers could apply his theory. In particular, he developed and described a technique called job enrichment for structuring employee tasks. Because it's gained popularity so quickly, the two-factor theory has been scrutinized more than almost any other organizational behavior theory. The results have been contradictory, to say the least. The initial study by Herzberg and his associates supported the basic premises of the theory, as did a few follow-up studies. In general, studies that use the same methodology as Herzberg did, content analysis of recalled incidents, tend to support the theory. However, this methodology has itself been criticized, and studies that use other methods to measure satisfaction and dissatisfaction frequently obtain results quite different from Herzberg's. It's not surprising, then, that the two-factor theory is no longer held in high esteem by organizational behavior researchers. Indeed, the field has since adopted a far more complex and valid conceptualization of motivation. But because the initial popularity and its general guidance for application, the two-factor theory merits a special place in the history of motivational research. The acquired needs framework was advanced by David McClelland and centers on the needs for achievement, affiliation, and power. These needs are also sometimes referred to as manifest needs. A key differentiating element of this framework is the argument that these needs are acquired or learned from cultural, social, and family influences. The need for achievement arises from an individual's desire to accomplish a goal or task more effectively than in the past. Individuals who have a high need for achievement tend to set moderately difficult goals and make moderately risky decisions. High-need achievers also want immediate, specific feedback on their performance. They want to know how well they did something as quickly after finishing as possible. Preoccupation with work is another characteristic of high-need achievers. They think about it on their way to the workplace, during lunch, and at home. Finally, high-need achievers tend to assume personal responsibility for getting things done. They often volunteer for extra duties and find it difficult to delegate part of a job to someone else. Accordingly, they derive a feeling of accomplishment when they've done more than their peers without the assistance of others. Although high-need achievers tend to be successful, they often do not achieve top management posts. The most common explanation is that although the high need for achievement helps these people advance quickly through the ranks, the traits associated with the need often conflict with the requirements of high-level management positions. Because of the amount of work they're expected to do, top executives must be able to delegate tasks to others. In addition, they seldom receive immediate feedback, and they often must make decisions that are either more or less risky than those with which a high-need achiever would be comfortable. The equity theory of motivation is based on a relatively simple premise that people in organizations want to be treated fairly. The equity theory defines equity as the belief that we're being treated fairly in relation to others. and defines inequity as the belief that we're not being treated fairly in comparison to others. Equity theory is just one of several theoretical formulations derived from social comparison processes. Social comparisons involve evaluating our own situations in terms of others' situations. In this course, we focus mainly on equity theory because it's the most highly developed tool of the social comparison approaches, and one that applies most directly to the motivation of people and organizations. People in organizations form perceptions of the equity of their treatment through a four-step process. First, they evaluate how they're being treated by the organization. Second, they form a perception of how a comparison other is being treated. The comparison other might be a person in the same work group, someone in another part of the organization, or even a composite of several people scattered throughout the organization. Third, they compare their own circumstances with those of the comparison other, and then use this comparison as a basis for forming an impression of either equity or inequity. Fourth, depending on the strength of this feeling, the person may choose to pursue one or more alternatives. Equity theory describes the equity comparison process in terms of an input to outcome ratio. Inputs are the individual's contributions to the organization, such as factors as education, experience, effort, and loyalty. Outcomes are what the person receives in return: pay, recognition, social relationships, intrinsic rewards, and similar things. This figure summarizes the results of an equity comparison. If a person feels equitably treated, he or she is generally motivated to maintain the status quo. People may use one of 6 common methods to reduce inequity. First, we may change our own inputs. Second, we may change our own outcomes. Third, a more complex response is to alter our perceptions of ourselves or our behavior. Fourth, we may alter our perception of the comparison others' inputs or outcomes. Fifth, we may change the object of comparison. And finally, as a last resort, we may simply leave the situation. People form equity perceptions by comparing their situation to that of someone else's. If they perceive equity, they're motivated to maintain the current situation. If they perceive inequity, they're motivated to use strategies to reduce that inequity. Expectancy theory suggests that people are motivated by how much they want something and the likelihood they perceive of getting it. Expectancy theory is a more encompassing model of motivation than equity theory. Over the years since its original formulation, the theory's scope and complexity have continued to grow. Victor Vrahm is generally credited with first applying the theory of motivation to the workplace. The theory attempts to determine how individuals choose among alternative behaviors. The basic premise of expectancy theory is that motivation depends on how much we want something and how likely we are to get it. This figure summarizes the basic expectancy model. The model's general components are effort, the result of motivated behavior, performance, and outcomes. Expectancy theory emphasizes the linkages among these elements, which are described in terms of expectancies, instrumentalities, and valences. Effort to performance expectancy is a person's perception of the probability that effort will lead to successful performance. Performance to outcome instrumentality is a person's perception of the probability that performance will lead to certain other outcomes. An outcome is anything that might potentially result from performance. High performance conceivably might produce such outcomes as a pay raise, a promotion, recognition from the boss, fatigue, stress, less time to rest, among others. The valence of the outcome is the relative attractiveness or unattractiveness, the value of the outcome to the person. Pay raises, promotions, and recognition might all have positive valences, whereas fatigue, stress, and less time and rest might have negative valence. The strength of outcome valences varies from person to person. Work-related stress may be a significant negative factor for one person, but only a slight annoyance to another. The basic expectancy framework suggests that 3 conditions must be met before motivated behavior occurs. First, the effort to performance expectancy must be well above 0. That is, the worker must reasonably expect that exerting effort will produce high levels of performance. Second, the performance to outcome instrumentalities must be well above zero. In other words, the person must believe that performance will realistically result in valued outcomes. Third, the sum of all the variances for the potential outcomes relevant to the person must be positive. One or more variances may be negative as long as the positives outweigh the negatives. Expectancy theory is so complicated that researchers have found it to be quite difficult to test. In particular, the measures of various paths of the model may lack validity, and the procedures for investigating relationships among the variables have been less scientific than researchers would like. Moreover, people are seldom as rational and objective in choosing behaviors as expectancy theory implies. Still, the logic of the model, combined with the consistent, albeit modest, research support for it, suggests that the theory has much to offer. Because expectancy theory is so complex, it's difficult to apply directly in the workplace. A manager would need to figure out what the rewards each employee wants and how valuable those rewards are to each person, measure the various expectancies, and finally adjust the relationships to create motivation. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or behavioral potential that results from direct or indirect experience. The most influential historical approach to learning is classical conditioning, developed by Ivan Pavlov in his famous experiments with dogs. Classical conditioning is a simple form of learning in which conditioned responses are linked with an unconditioned stimulus. In organizations, however, only simple behaviors and responses can be learned in this manner. For example, suppose an employee receives very bad news one day from his boss. It's possible that the employee could come to associate, say, the color of the boss's suit that day with bad news. Thus, the next time the boss wears that same suit to the office, the employee may experience dread or forbearing. But this form of learning is obviously simplistic and not directly related to motivation. Learning theorists soon recognized that although classical conditioning offered some interesting insights into the learning process, it was inadequate as an explanation of human learning. Although it's not tied to a single theory or model, contemporary learning theory generally views learning as a cognitive process. That is, it assumes that people are conscious, active participants in how they learn. First, the cognitive view suggests that people draw on their experiences and use past learning as a basis for their present behavior. These experiences represent knowledge or cognitions. Second, people make choices about their behavior. The employee recognizes that she has two alternatives and chooses one. Third, people recognize the consequences of their choices. Thus, when the employee finds the job assignment rewarding and fulfilling, she'll recognize that the choice was a good one and will understand why. Finally, people evaluate these consequences and add them to prior learning, which affects future choices. Faced with the same job choices next year, the employee will probably be motivated to choose the same behavior. Several perspectives on learning take a cognitive view. Reinforcement theory is based on the idea that behavior is a function of its consequences. Behavior that results in pleasant consequences is more likely to be repeated. The employee will be motivated to repeat the current behavior. And behavior that results in unpleasant consequences is less likely to be repeated. The employee will be motivated to engage in different behavior. Reinforcement theory also suggests that any given situation, people can explore a variety of possible behaviors. Future behavioral choices are affected by the consequences of earlier behaviors. In its simplest form, reinforcement theory suggests that behavior is a function of its consequences. Social learning occurs when people observe the behaviors of others, recognize the consequences, and alter their own behavior as a result. Some experts refer to social learning as social cognitive theory. A person can learn to do a new job by observing others or by watching videos. Or an employee may learn to avoid being late by seeing the boss chew out fellow coworkers for doing the same. Social learning theory then suggests that individual behavior is determined by a person's cognitions and social environment. More specifically, people are presumed to learn behaviors and attitudes at least partly in response to what others expect of them. Several conditions must be met to produce an appropriate environment for social learning. First, the behavior being observed and initiated must be relatively simple. Although we can learn by watching someone else push 3 or 4 buttons to set specifications on a machine or to turn on a computer, we probably cannot learn a complicated sequence of operations for the machine or how to run complex software packages without practicing the various steps ourselves. Second, social learning usually involves observed and imitated behavior that's concrete, not intellectual. We can usually learn by watching others how to respond to different behaviors of a particular manager or how to assemble a few component parts into a final assembled product. But we probably cannot learn through simple observation how to write computer software, how to write a complicated text, how to conceptualize, or how to think abstractly. Finally, for social learning to occur, we must possess the physical ability to imitate the behavior being observed. Social learning influences motivation in a variety of ways. Many of the behaviors we exhibit in our daily work lives are learned from others. Behavior modification is the application of reinforcement theory to influence the behaviors of people in organizational settings. One aspect of behavior modification is the use of various kinds of reinforcement when employees are observed behaving in desired or undesired ways. This figure summarizes these kinds of reinforcement. There are 4 types of reinforcers as shown, both positive and negative, that present stimulus or remove stimulus, known as positive reinforcement, punishment, extinction, and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement involves the use of rewards to increase the likelihood that a desired behavior will be repeated. Negative reinforcement is based on the removal of current or future unpleasant consequences to increase the likelihood that someone will repeat a behavior. In other words, avoidance or removal of something undesirable can be motivating. Punishment is the application of negative outcomes to decrease the likelihood of a behavior. Finally, extinction involves the removal of other reinforcement, positive or negative, following the incidence of a behavior to be extinguished or to decrease the likelihood that the behavior would be repeated. For reinforcement to work, people must associate the reward with the behavior. In other words, people need to know exactly why they're receiving the reward. To best reinforce behavior, the reward should come as quickly as possible after the behavior. The reward can be almost anything and does not need to cost a lot of money, but it must be something desired by the recipient. Some of the most powerful rewards are symbolic, things that cost very little but mean a lot to the people who get them. Examples of symbolic rewards are things like plaques or certificates. Rewards also impact ethical behavior choices. Although multiple studies have shown that incentives can increase unethical behavior, the effect of rewards and punishments on ethical behavior are complex. Rewards do not always increase ethical behavior because the presence of the reward can undermine the intrinsic value of the ethical behavior itself. A continuous reinforcement schedule is one in which the desired behavior is reinforced each time that it occurs. A partial reinforcement schedule is one in which the desired behavior is reinforced only part of the time. There are 4 types of partial reinforcement schedules. Fixed ratio, where the desired behavior is reinforced after a specified number of correct responses. Fixed interval, where the desired behavior is reinforced after a certain amount of time has passed. A variable ratio, where the desired behavior is reinforced after an unpredictable number of behaviors. And finally, a variable interview, where the desired behavior is reinforced after an unpredictable amount of time has elapsed. To motivate the right behavior, an expert in behavior modification would identify the desired behaviors and then carefully reinforce them. This process includes 5 steps. Define the problem. What is it that could be improved? Identify and define the specific behaviors you wish to change. Record and track the occurrence of the target behavior. Analyze the current negative consequences of the undesired behavior and arrange for more positive consequences to follow the desired behavior, and evaluate whether the behavior has improved and by how much. In terms of behavior modification, any behavior can be understood as being a result of its consequences. In other words, as a manager, you get whatever behavior you're rewarding.